When Queen Latifah walked onto the set of Living Single, she carried more than a script and a smile. Behind the laughter there was tension, grief, and a creative line that was quietly being crossed. What most viewers never realized is that one moment, brief, uncomfortable, and rarely discussed, changed how the show was treated forever. And once that line was crossed, there was no turning back. A show that was never supposed to fail. When Living Single premiered, it didn't announce itself as a revolution. It didn't rely on shock value or spectacle. Instead, it arrived with something far more dangerous in television: quiet confidence. 6 black characters, educated, opinionated, imperfect, emotionally layered, shared a Brooklyn brownstone while navigating careers, love, money, and adulthood. At its center was Khadijah James, portrayed by Queen Latifah, a woman who ran her own magazine, paid her own bills, and commanded respect without needing to soften herself for approval. At a time when black women on television were often written as sidekicks or stereotypes, Khadijah existed as a fully formed lead. The show's strength was never exaggeration. It didn't lean on cartoonish personalities or easy punchlines. Its humor came from conversation, timing, and recognition. Moments that felt pulled from real apartments, real friendships, real frustrations. That authenticity is what built its audience. Viewers didn't just laugh at Living Single, they recognized themselves in it. For many, it was the first time television reflected their lives without explanation or apology. From the beginning, the series performed well. Not explosively, but consistently. It earned loyalty, not hype. That distinction mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Because while Living Single was establishing itself, another sitcom entered the landscape and rapidly absorbed the industry's attention. When Friends debuted, comparisons became unavoidable, not because the shows were similar in substance, but because they occupied the same format: 6 friends, city life, young adulthood. But the similarities ended there. One was allowed to be universal by default. The other was treated as specific, niche, and therefore fragile. That shift quietly altered Living Single's trajectory. Network enthusiasm cooled. Promotional muscle softened. Creative oversight tightened. Scripts that once flowed naturally were suddenly questioned for tone. Jokes were flagged not for being weak, but for being too much. Writers were encouraged to smooth edges that had originally defined the show's voice. The message wasn't explicit, but it was clear. The margin for error was shrinking. Behind the scenes, cast members felt it. The atmosphere changed from confident to cautious. Risk, emotional, thematic, or political, was no longer rewarded. And for Queen Latifah, this moment collided with something far more personal. During the early seasons, she was carrying profound grief from the loss of her brother and unresolved trauma from violence she had survived. On screen, she projected authority and humor. Off-screen, she was processing pain in silence. That emotional weight deepened her performance, but it also hardened her principles. She wasn't interested in diluting truth to make anyone more comfortable. As seasons passed, Living Single was no longer just competing for ratings. It was fighting to remain itself. And in television, that is often the most dangerous position to occupy. The show hadn't failed creatively or culturally. It had simply become inconvenient. It was during this fragile balance, between success and scrutiny, that one brief moment, one scene that refused to flatten itself, triggered a reaction the series would never fully recover from. The moment, the room went quiet. By the time Living Single entered its later seasons, the energy behind the scenes no longer matched what audiences saw on screen. What had once been a collaborative environment, where writers, actors, and producers trusted each other's instincts, had shifted into something far more guarded. Scripts were no longer approached as creative blueprints, but as potential liabilities. Every line of dialogue, every pause, every emotional exchange was weighed against an invisible standard that didn't originate in the writer's room. It came from above. The network wanted assurance, safety, broadness, a tone that would never raise eyebrows, even if it meant lowering the show's voice. The irony was painful. Living Single had never relied on confrontation for shock value. Its power came from truth spoken casually, humorously, sometimes uncomfortably, but always recognizably. It trusted the audience to understand nuance. That trust, however, was becoming a problem. It was in this climate that a particular scene was filmed. On the surface, it looked ordinary. No profanity, no explicit subject matter, no moment that could be isolated and labeled as inappropriate. But the tone was unmistakably different. The humor didn't resolve neatly. The frustration in the dialogue lingered. Power dynamics were acknowledged instead of brushed aside. Emotional boundaries were tested rather than restored by a punchline. It felt less like television and more like real conversation, the kind people have when they stop pretending everything is fine. This was the kind of moment Living Single had delivered many times before. But this time, something changed. Those present reportedly felt it almost immediately. The room, once relaxed, grew still. Laughter didn't come as easily. Takes stretched longer. Conversations between scenes became quieter, more careful. This wasn't about concern over audience reaction. Viewers had always embraced honesty. The fear came from somewhere else entirely. From executives who suddenly realized that the show wasn't just reflecting life, it was interpreting it. And interpretation, especially when it comes from voices that don't traditionally control the narrative, makes systems uneasy. For Queen Latifah, the reaction to that scene landed with particular weight. Long before television, she had built her identity around directness and principle. In music, she had spoken openly about respect, power, and self-definition. Acting was never meant to require silence. Watching how quickly the atmosphere shifted made something painfully clear. Honesty had become a liability, not because it was inaccurate, but because it couldn't be shaped, softened, or repackaged once it was spoken. What followed was not dramatic. There was no announcement, no confrontation that could be quoted or denied. Instead, the show began to feel less important. Promotional efforts slowed, scheduling decisions subtly changed, creative notes multiplied, often vague but restrictive. Writers were encouraged to avoid certain tones without being told exactly why. The message didn't need to be stated. Everyone understood it. The show hadn't broken a rule. It had crossed an unspoken line. And in television, once a series is perceived as difficult rather than dependable, the outcome is rarely immediate. But it is almost always inevitable. The clock doesn't start ticking loudly, it starts ticking quietly. When principle became a problem. After that episode aired, there was no press release, no emergency meeting announced to the public, no controversy splashed across headlines. On the surface, Living Single continued as if nothing had happened. But internally, the shift was immediate and unmistakable. Network notes arrived faster and carried a sharper edge. They were no longer framed as suggestions or collaborative refinements. They were directives. Storylines were questioned less for their structure or humor and more for how they felt. Tone became the new red flag. Characters who had once been allowed to show frustration, ambition, or moral disagreement were now expected to soften their reactions. Emotional honesty was treated as volatility. Conversations that reflected real-life tension were labeled too heavy or too pointed. The very edge that had given the show its pulse, the thing audiences connected to, was being quietly sanded down in the name of comfort. This pressure did not land evenly across the cast. Some adapted silently, understanding the unspoken rules of television survival. Longevity, they knew, often depended on flexibility. Others found the shift harder to accept. The writers, who had built Living Single on intelligent dialogue and lived-in realism, were suddenly rewriting scenes not because they were poorly written, but because they were uncomfortable. That word began to do a lot of work. It didn't mean inaccurate. It didn't mean offensive. It meant risky. An unspoken rule took hold. Laughter was welcome, but honesty had limits. The consequences of that rule became visible in how certain characters were treated. Roles that had once carried narrative weight began to drift to the margins. Screen time changed without explanation. Story arcs stalled or quietly disappeared. What appeared to be creative decisions were often reactions to tension happening far from the camera. The show was no longer just being written, it was being managed. One of the clearest examples of this shift involved T.C. Carson. His character, once central, gradually lost presence. Behind the scenes, Carson was known for speaking his mind and pushing back when something didn't feel right. That refusal to simply comply made him increasingly difficult to place within a system that had grown allergic to resistance. In an environment where agreement equaled safety, conviction became a problem. For Queen Latifah, the situation cut even deeper. She was already carrying unresolved grief from the loss of her brother and lingering trauma from violence she had survived years earlier. Acting had become a place of grounding, a way to channel strength rather than expose vulnerability. But now, the very emotional truth she brought to Khadijah James, the calm authority, the unspoken resilience, was being treated as something to contain. What hurt most was not overt criticism. It was the silence, the subtle withdrawal of support, the sense that the show was no longer being defended when questions arose. Living Single was still on the air, but it no longer felt protected. And in television, protection is everything. Once that shield disappears, survival doesn't end immediately. It just becomes temporary. The slow withdrawal. No one announced. By the final stretch of Living Single, the show wasn't canceled. It was quietly starved. This is how television often ends stories that are no longer considered convenient. Budgets tighten without explanation. Promotional support fades. Time slots shift. What remains is a series still technically alive, but no longer treated as essential. The cast felt it. Scripts arrived later. Long-term story planning disappeared. Instead of building toward a meaningful conclusion, episodes began to feel like placeholders, as if everyone understood that the end was coming, but no one was willing to say it out loud. There was no scandal, no dramatic public fallout, just a gradual erosion of momentum. This was especially painful, given what Living Single represented. The show had proven it could sustain an audience without diluting its voice. It had done so for years. Yet once it was perceived as difficult rather than dependable, its value changed in the eyes of the network. The infamous scene had not broken any rules, but it had revealed something the system preferred not to confront. The show was not afraid of emotional truth. For Queen Latifah, this period marked a turning point. She could sense the ceiling closing in. Acting had opened doors, but television had also shown its limits. Rather than fight a losing battle, she began redirecting her energy toward film and projects where her voice carried more autonomy. Other cast members felt the same uncertainty. Careers were at different stages, but the shared experience was unmistakable. Living Single was ending not because it failed, but because it no longer fit the system's priorities. The silence surrounding that truth made it harder to process than outright rejection. And when the final episode aired, it did so without ceremony, no tribute, no acknowledgement of cultural impact, just an ending that felt smaller than the journey that led to it. How time changed the verdict. Years after it quietly left the air, Living Single began to be re-examined, not by networks, but by audiences who had grown up with it. Millennials, especially those who came of age in the late 1990s and early 2000s, returned to the series with older eyes and sharper awareness. What once felt like simple comedy now read as layered, intentional, and emotionally grounded. And that infamous moment, the one that unsettled executives, no longer felt inappropriate. It felt honest. Streaming, social media, and cultural hindsight changed the conversation. Viewers began noticing what had been ignored before: the intelligence of the writing, the specificity of the characters, and the way the show allowed Black professionals to exist without translation or apology. Scenes that once triggered discomfort inside boardrooms were now praised for their realism. The line that had been crossed was never about content. It was about control. For Queen Latifah, history offered a quiet vindication. She moved forward, built an expansive career, and carried the lessons of living single into every project that followed. But the show itself became something even more powerful in absence. It became proof that being ahead of your time often comes with a cost. The tragedy of living single isn't that it ended. It's that it ended without acknowledgement, without reflection, and without being allowed to finish on its own terms. That single moment didn't destroy the show overnight. It exposed a system that was never fully prepared to protect it. And decades later, that realization feels heavier than any laugh track ever could. So what do you think? Was living single pushed aside for saying too much, or was it simply too honest for its time? Let us know in the comments, and if this story changed how you see the show, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.